Have you ever wondered what happened before the Big Bang? Well, it turns out scientists actually do know the answer to this question. You might not like the answer, but it is an answer nonetheless. And if you stick with me all the way to the end, I'll tell you why they think that this is probably the only possible answer. Hi, I'm here to try to make science understandable and interesting to you. If you want to learn more about how the universe began, well, you've come to the right place. So let's talk about the beginning of time itself. Let's start off by asking what the Big Bang actually means. When most people think of the Big Bang, they imagine an explosion, some sort of violent event that sent everything flying outward in all directions. But when scientists say Big Bang, they're not referring to an explosion at all. They are referring to a period of rapid expansion in the early history of the universe. Rapid being the operative word here. Now, we don't know exactly what happened prior to this period of rapid expansion, but we have a pretty good idea of what happened during and after, about 13.8 billion years ago. The entire universe contained within it all the matter, energy, space, and time that exists today. It was incredibly dense, hot, and no bigger than an atom. Then something happened. Maybe nothing really. Space expanded rapidly, stretching from subatomic dimensions to intergalactic distances in a fraction of a second. This is what we call the Big Bang, the instant the universe went from unimaginably small to unimaginably large. After that, things began to cool down, and gravity caused particles to collide and form the first simple elements like hydrogen and helium. Within a few 100 million years, these elements formed the first stars and galaxies. Around 500 million years later, those stars produced the first heavier elements, and eventually the Earth formed, complete with life and eventually intelligent beings who sought to understand their place in the cosmos. And so that's the story of how we got here. But what about before? What happened before the Big Bang? Well, that's where things get kind of weird. You see, the Big Bang Theory doesn't just explain how the universe began. It explains how the universe began expanding. We know for a fact that the universe is expanding today, but the idea that it started expanding around the time of the Big Bang is less obvious. In fact, we can actually use observations of the expanding universe to infer how it began. In the late 1920s, the astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered that distant galaxies were all moving away from us. The farther the galaxy, the faster it seemed to recede into the distance. This observation led to what's called Hubble's law, which states that the more distant a galaxy is, the faster it is moving away from us. Because of this, we know that the universe is expanding. Like if I took two galaxies that are currently 100 million light-years apart and I rewound time, those same two galaxies would be 99 million light-years apart, then 98 million light-years apart, and so on. At some point, they would be so close to each other that they would appear as one until eventually they would be on top of each other. And if we think about this a bit further, we can apply this logic to the entire universe. Everything would be infinitely close together at time zero, infinitely small, you might say. So if we know the universe was expanding at any time in the past, we can assume it was also expanding at all times prior to that. It would be pretty odd if it wasn't. Imagine you had a friend who suddenly appeared next to you and asked you to explain how he got there. Would you tell him that you know how you got there, but you aren't sure if he teleported or walked or flew or drove or something else? Probably not. It makes much more sense that your friend used the same mode of transportation to get there that he is currently using. This is what scientists mean when they say the universe has been expanding forever. The only way they could conceive of the universe coming into existence is as an eternally expanding system. And that's fine, except it creates another problem, because it leaves us with the question, well, what happened before the universe began expanding? Well, scientists have an answer for that too, according to Einstein's theory of general relativity. Space and time intertwined in a sort of fabric called space-time cannot be infinitely warped. It's like if you drew a line on a piece of paper and tried to keep extending it forever. Eventually, you would run out of paper. This isn't to say that space-time is flat. In fact, the opposite is true. Space-time can be bent and warped in all sorts of ways. Stars and planets cause space-time to curve around them. Black holes warp space-time so much that they rip it apart completely. But no matter how much space-time is warped, it can never be infinitely warped. There must always be a limit to how much you can warp space and time. If that's true, then we could take our hypothetical line representing space-time, bend it into a circle, and keep doing that over and over again. Each loop would represent a new universe that began expanding at the Big Bang. And if you go one step further and picture all of these loops stacked on top of each other, you've just created a three-dimensional surface, a universe without a beginning or an end, a universe without edges. So that's the answer. Scientists believe that before the universe expanded, it simply wasn't. Time didn't exist. Space didn't exist. Nothing existed. And at the moment of the Big Bang, everything came into existence. But then again, nothing is really nothing. If you think about it, even saying that nothing existed is pretty difficult to say because it implies that something, namely yourself, is doing the observing. And if you are doing the observing, then something exists. So it would seem that the idea of nothing existing is actually a self-contradictory statement. Some scientists have taken this to mean that the universe cannot actually be eternal, that there must have been a moment in time when everything came into existence. That's because if you have a series of events and every single event requires something to happen, then at some point you have to start with the initial conditions, the thing that causes the first event. In the case of our expanding universe, that would mean that at some point there had to be a finite amount of space and a finite amount of time. For our universe to begin expanding, there needed to be room for it to expand into and time for it to expand. You know, when I heard this argument for the first time, I thought, oh great. We just pushed the beginning of the universe back a little bit farther, and now we need to figure out what happened before that. And then I realized that this argument actually applies to the idea of the universe being eternal as well. Just because the universe has always been expanding does not mean that it always will be. Maybe at some point the expansion will slow down and the universe will stop expanding and begin contracting. Maybe the expansion will speed up and tear our universe apart and fuse it with another universe. Maybe nothing will change. Really, the only way we know of for the universe to continue expanding is if there is some force causing it to expand. In the current scientific paradigm, that force is called dark energy, but we don't really know anything about dark energy except that it exists. In fact, we have yet to even directly observe dark energy. We just observe the effects that it has on the expansion of the universe. So it's entirely possible that dark energy will change or disappear altogether at some point in the future. And if that happens, our universe will stop expanding and collapse. When that happens, I have no idea what will occur next. I mean, according to Einstein's equations, all of the matter in the universe would be squished together in a single point, and then everything would explode all over again in a new Big Bang. But I suspect that whatever comes next will not be governed by the laws of physics that we currently understand. It's almost certain that there will be new forces and new constants of nature that we currently haven't even imagined. So that's the current state of affairs. We know how the universe began expanding. We just don't know what happened before it began expanding. And what's really fascinating is that depending on what happens with dark energy, it may not even matter if we want to find out what happened before the Big Bang, because it may not exist. Thanks for watching.